This presentation will go over issues of sexual health, including the use of dating and meetup apps while studying abroad to help prepare you for your upcoming international experiences. Whether or not you engage in sexual activity while abroad, it is important to know the differences in access to sexual health care providers and safer sex supplies in your host country compared to the U.S. It's also important to review Northwestern's definition of consent and how that interacts with not only your understanding of consent, but how your host country approaches the issue as well. In the US, dating and meetup apps are a common way for people to meet others, and similar apps may also be available in your host country. Think about how your previous experiences with these apps shape your approach to using them while in other countries. The availability and cost of contraception and safer sex supplies vary from country to country. We recommend learning about your host country's political and social perspectives on reproductive and sexual health. Look into what the societal differences might be when it comes to relationships and dating in your host country, and if there are language or customs to be aware of. Healthcare systems differ around the world and may be different in their level of awareness of LGBTQ health needs. Talk to your study abroad advisor should you need to maintain current treatment, which can be prearranged through Northwestern's international healthcare provider. If you will be sexually active while abroad, learn about the resources that will be available for safer sex in your host country. You can bring your own safer sex materials for use abroad if you are unsure as to their availability in the host country. If safer sex supplies such as male and female condoms, dental dams, gloves and finger cots, and lubricant will be expensive or complicated to get in your host country, you may want to consider traveling with a sufficient supply. Before departure, contact your international healthcare insurance provider and/or care about access to contraception and sexual health providers abroad to see what methods work best for your situation. On campus, there are free condoms on the third floor of Searle and many additional contraceptive options available through the health service. They will also be happy to talk to you about the options of long-active, reversible contraception prior to departure if you are interested. As you research cultural differences related to relationships, dating, language, or terminology in your host country, it's helpful to reflect on Northwestern's definition of consent, which may influence your views of dating, sexual relationships, and consent abroad. There are 5 main components of consent: knowing, active, voluntary, present, and ongoing. Let's take a closer look at them. The goal here is to take into account how U.S. dating norms and your personal experiences at Northwestern influence your view of dating, sexual relationships, and consent abroad. Knowing consent refers to the who, what, where, when, and why of sexual activity. This refers to all parties agreeing on who is involved in sexual activity, what the sexual activity is that one is engaged in. Remember, consent to one kind of sexual activity does not automatically mean consent to another sexual activity. When this sexual activity is happening, and why it is happening. Active consent refers to the opposite of passive consent. Active consent is clear, enthusiastic, and willing. If consent involves, sure, I guess, while shrugging shoulders, that is not active. Think about how active someone is in their consent. If anyone seems passive, take a pause and evaluate. Voluntary refers to clear-minded consent which involves sobriety and mental capacity. Being drunk or high does not equate with true consent because your mind is altered. Alcohol and drugs can also be used as a tool of power and control to get sex, so think about how substance use affects your and others' ability to provide consent. Present means consent in the here and now. Even if sex was decided upon hours before meeting up, do not assume that still holds when the time comes. People can change their minds. Additionally, just because you've already engaged in sexual activity with someone before does not mean that is automatic consent or accurate assumption that sexual activity will happen again. Ongoing refers to consent not being a one-time decided upon thing. Consent can be taken back by someone at any point during a sexual encounter. Again, people's minds change even during sexual activity. If this happens, use it as an opportunity to talk to each other about what is going on without being coercive. It's also a great idea to check in with each other even while sexual activity is taking place, and stop sexual activity if someone seems like they are getting uncomfortable. Dating norms in the U.S. may also vary drastically from your host countries, so reflect on how personal experiences may influence your view of sex and relationships abroad. Because cultural and language differences can make all relationships more challenging, it's important to consider your own values of consent in healthy relationships and how to communicate them. Remember, even though it's important that you understand what consent looks like in your host country, do not feel pressure to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. Use our Northwestern discussion and understanding of consent to help guide your decisions. You still have a right to consent to healthy and fun sexual behaviors abroad if you choose to do so. Speaking to Global Learning Office ambassadors and other returnees is a great way for you to learn about what's defined as typical dating and sexual relationship behavior in your host country. Once you arrive, you can also talk to people your own age to gauge what is typical. SHAPE students at Northwestern have also received extensive training on sexual health and consent, and many of them have studied or lived abroad. They are an excellent informal resource to answer any of your questions or help you investigate resources. Your international health insurance provider, Care and Health Services can also work together to answer your questions. As you prepare for your study abroad experience, you may be considering ways to meet people and romantic partners. Using dating apps and meetup apps are becoming increasingly popular among students abroad. It's important to consider cultural understandings regarding the use of dating apps in your host country and how this may differ from the U.S. context. Students have reported that using dating apps abroad can be a helpful tool to meet others and feel more immersed in their host city. However, it is vital to understand which apps are commonly used in your country, if at all, and how. Do not think of using these apps as any different as you would while home in the U.S. from a safety perspective. Just as you would at home, create a safety plan for yourself, including a buddy contact to check in with. Plan for a consistent location for meetups that you can become familiar with, or make sure to schedule safe dates which take place in public places. Carefully research any locations before meeting somewhere unfamiliar. Lastly, remember to pack a journal, extra phone charger, map if applicable, and any safe sex supplies that you might use. Take a look at this map for the most widely used dating apps by country. To recap, research dating culture and availability of safer sex supplies in your host country. Consider how consent in your host country may differ from Northwestern's definition, and reach out to resources on campus at Northwestern, such as CARE, the Women's Center, SHAPE, and GLOW ambassadors.